Time is no more, space is of no consequence. It's your intention to consent to God's presence and action now, in this moment, that allows the Spirit to pray in you for the intentions of the Spirit, which is that God's will may be done from the beginning to the end of the human race. And beyond, who knows what God has in store beyond that. So you're praying for everything that is good. You're also praying in union with Christ, because the centering prayer is a participation. Remember, it's a concrete expression of your baptismal commitment, your engagement with Christ, which involves the death of the false self and the inner resurrection of the true self, along with all of the graces and benefits that are inherent in that inner resurrection process that I'll speak about in a moment. So to pray in secret, then, is to pray in secret from yourself. No self-reflection. Hence, such commentaries as, I did better yesterday. Why did I ever start this process? Will the time ever end? Would someone please tell the Trappist to stay home and not bother ordinary people with these? Where are those thoughts coming from? Right out of the ego and right out of the interior dialogue that we had agreed to drop when we closed the door intentionally. But you see, our feelings and thoughts pay no attention to our intention. They just laugh. So we're not going to have any thoughts. Just try it, they say. And then we get frustrated. But when you get frustrated, what is that? It's just another thought. And so if you've learned the guidelines thoroughly, you do with that what you do with any perception at all. Remember, thoughts in the centering prayer are feelings, images, concepts, plans, past, future, sensations outside, sensations inside. The agreement is, you enter the inner room, you leave every stimulation of knowledge outside to open to the intuitive presence of God and to the divine presence itself, which is beyond any experience. It's awesome, this invitation. Here you are alone with the alone. But the alone is home and loves you, and you couldn't be in a safer place. It's just that you have to keep going back there to establish new habits of thought and relating to reality over and against the habitual ones that we've been following for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 80 years. By returning again and again for a reasonable period of time, we suggest 20 minutes to a half an hour twice a day, you're slowly rolling back the misguided development of the false self over the whole of your life. Now, what goes on in the inner room? This is fascinating stuff. We're not just exposing ourselves to the divine presence. We do that by consenting, and we choose, as you know, a sacred symbol to support our consent when the inevitable thoughts come down the stream of consciousness that stimulate our programs for happiness or our over-identification with our group. Both of these are the two cornerstones of the false self system. So in the secrecy of the prayer, when we're not thinking about ourselves, Or when we do, we return ever so gently to the sacred symbol, usually a word that we've chosen. You may be bombarded with thoughts on the psychological level, but through your intention, you've moved to the spiritual level of your being, so no thoughts can hurt you unless you follow them. So you can have the wildest thoughts on earth, or the most murderous, if you prefer. They have no effect on diminishing the prayer unless you pursue them, unless you follow them. Intention is very powerful stuff. It's not understood how powerful it is, but let me give you just two examples. Those of you who are married, there was some point in the ceremony when somebody asked you if you would declare your intention to marry this guy, and you said, "I do." Immediately your whole life changed forever. I consider that a significant effect. Or, to put it differently, in the exercise of the sacraments, what confects the Eucharist? When the duly ordained person says, "This is my body," he simply has the intention of making the Eucharist. And that makes it happen, at least in our faith. It's not a big deal. There's no musculature involved here. There's a simple interior intention that effects this extraordinary result. Well, with all proportion guarded, when you make the intention to be at the spiritual level of your being, that's where you are. There's no obstacle. We are where our will is, and the intention is the expression of our will, the spiritual will, to be more exact. So when you sit down, you're manifesting that will, and you're actually sitting down with Christ on the cross, participating in the Paschal mystery, so that the joys and sorrows and the purification and are not just your sufferings in the process of healing the wounds of a lifetime, but are part of the redeeming work of Christ, which is redeeming you, but also everybody else in the human family, so that your participation is not just a privatized journey to perfection or wholeness, but is contributing to the healing of the whole human family in direct proportion to the intensity or purity of your union with God. It's that is the source of mission or apostolate. Remember, in the case of Mary Magdalene after Jesus' resurrection, it was she, whom he sent to the apostles to announce the resurrection. So the apostles were not advanced enough in love to be able to present this information. It was Mary who was more deeply advanced in love, that became thereby an apostle in her very being. So this is what is happening in centering prayer. You're becoming an apostle of Christ in your very being, so that whatever you do, whether you even mention the name of Christ out loud, is healing and transforming the emotional wounds of the world, beginning, of course, with our own. Okay, if we could be still long enough, you'd be transformed very quickly. It's not going to happen in a hurry. Even if you have great experiences, ecstasies, it doesn't change the permanent setup of our character. It's only over time that grace gradually unwinds the habits of a lifetime, so that the presence of God becomes second nature. Doesn't go away. You can't hang on to it. You can only open your mind and heart to it and wait for it to take root. Meanwhile, both you and God have to put up with the habitual nonsense that goes on in our heads most of the time. Now we have ourselves in the inner room. We've closed the door. We've got 20 minutes to a half an hour just to be still. And we're being bombarded with thoughts or stimulation to think about this or that. And as long as there's any attachment in your conscious or unconscious life, then every now and then a thought is going to catch you, because the roots of your attraction are still there. So it's letting go of the roots of our attachments that is the key to the healing of the wounds of a lifetime. And that can be reinforced in everyday life by recognizing, with God's help, what your predominant attractions are in the way of finding happiness through the instinctual needs of security, approval, or power and control. When you have no longer any desire to control anything, you'll probably be in divine union. There is no other obstacle. Or when you let go of your exaggerated desire for approval or affection and esteem, you're free. And there's no obstacle except these attachments. But the more subtle attachments, obviously, take longer and they require a more intensive treatment. You know, like some illnesses require more intense antibiotics, right? Or certain mental difficulties require a deeper kind of psychotherapy. Well, the divine psychotherapy goes deeper than any therapy, much more thorough. And God knows us perfectly inside and out and still loves us. And so here's where divine love is not sentimental. It relentlessly pursues everything in us that is selfish, because we can't have the freedom to enter the fullness of the kingdom, to which he compared the eye of the needle as a passageway. With that baggage, any possessive attitude is wealth in the perspective of the kingdom of God. So whether you have $1 billion or $10, if you are depending on this instead of God, you can't get through the eye of this needle. In fact, you notice here the gentle kind of humor that Jesus had. He doesn't usually tell jokes. Jokes are basically a rather secondary way of manifesting humor. The best kind of humor is spontaneous, which sees the amusement and strangeness in human foibles, and is not judgmental, but just enjoys the ridiculous way that people act, beginning with ourselves. And so you see this humor in Jesus from time to time, and I think imagine a camel getting through a needle. I mean, it's ridiculous. So he was talking to his disciples who were horrified with the idea that it would be hard for a rich person to get into the kingdom. And Jesus only emphasizes how hard it would be by saying it would be easier for a camel to get through an eye of a needle than for a rich person to get into the kingdom. Well, it sounds a little harsh at first sight, and it sounded like the end of the world to the disciples, who were still in business after all, and had by no means given up the idea of the value of the bottom line. But anyway, Jesus is implying if you want to get through the eye of a needle, the best transportation is not a camel. Obvious, but it draws a certain smile in thinking of how ridiculous people are in thinking that would succeed. It won't. But what is a rich person, in Jesus' view, is not how much money you have in the bank, but how attached you are to whatever you have in the bank, or don't even have in the bank, but still desire. So to let go of your dependence on the values that the culture represents as fulfilling your need to find happiness in the gratification of the instinctual needs of security, approval, and power. This is the root of, I would dare say, at least half of all of our emotional problems and our relationships. Without letting go of the exaggerations of those desires to find happiness there, in those things, then our relationships with God can get mixed up, and you can have a codependent relationship with God, a dysfunctional relationship with God, to use psychological terms. In other words, we find ourselves trying to manipulate God. Give me this. How dare you take away these conscious consolations in prayer? Do you think I'm going to continue to praying? Think again. So how people regard God, if it was, you wouldn't treat a dog the way some of us treat, at least not your favorite dog. In any case, this work of the inner room has two main thrusts. And the first one is the affirmation of our basic goodness. We're all made in the image of God, so we're basically very good. And this goodness can never be lost, no matter what happens or whatever horrors you may commit. The basic goodness that God gave to us in creating us in the first place can never be lost and remains, theologians tell us, even in hell. But here again is where the belief systems of our culture affect us. For all practical purposes, a lot of people in our culture especially have a low self-image. They were oppressed, rejected, their desires for happiness in the form of instinctual gratifications was withheld deliberately or not deliberately. They repressed the pain into the unconscious where the energy continues. The body becomes a warehouse for this negative energy and hence interferes subtly with our decisions in life and our attitudes towards other people. This is how the false self develops. And from 4 to 8, it's complexified by the social period in which we absorb the values of our parents, education, peer group, I suppose, the values on television and the internet. All of these things are impressed or imposed on a child's mind because it doesn't have the resources of reason yet to evaluate them. So the child helplessly or unquestioningly absorbs these belief systems as the truth because there's no alternative. And so this is the radical problem of the unconscious. The discovery of the unconscious 100 and 150 years ago, one of the greatest contributions to the spiritual journey of all time, I would say, because although it was intuited by the great mystics, modern psychology has given us a very clear and detailed diagnosis of how this thing works and the damage it does to our relationships. So if you have this enormous desire for control that it hasn't been satisfied at all, but constantly frustrated, then one doesn't want to face the pain of remembering it. And so it's as if one didn't have this desire for control. It's hidden from us, and we glorify it by various names, saying this is prestige or manliness or feminineness or whatever is the mystifying intent. But meanwhile, the energy itself merrily goes on, fouling up our relationships, and we're not even aware of the problems that we're creating for other people, because it seems like second nature to us, and that everybody, it should be obvious to everybody that they should do what we say. How can they doubt it? Isn't it obvious that we're in? And it doesn't occur to us there's something off or something a little strange about this position. But it could also be the need for approval, or it could be the demand for security. And here's where security needs are especially subtle, because the greatest security is usually given to us through our religious commitment. Now, there's nothing wrong with religion, and we have certainly, this is the normal way to develop our relationship with God. But we bring to our religious attitudes these unconscious motives of control, approval, but especially security. So sometimes we defend our religion not because we really believe it's the truth, which it may be, but our real motive is hidden from us because we want to find in our particular observance the ultimate security. If I practice my religion, then everybody else is wrong and I can peacefully despise them. And God has to reward me now by putting me in heaven because I accept all the tenets of this particular religion. Baloney. This is not true religion at all. It's simply a desire to find gratification in something that appeals to our or strengthens our need of security in the form of certitude in our religion. And hence it interferes with our respect and understanding of other people's religions. And ultimately it has led to the kind of violence that has made religion the absolute bane of the universe for centuries. And it's still going on. Religious convictions that lead to war is not religion. Even the Pope has said this. No violence is justified from the perspective for a religious motive. Maybe defense under certain circumstances, but nothing else. And in a world where defense might involve nuclear weapons which would destroy everybody, I would think there's serious doubt about whether you can defend yourself even, if it's pretty sure that these weapons will be involved. So here we are at the very edge of utter catastrophe in this world right now. And all the more reason why those who are doing centering prayer, their contribution is enormous, because who knows what to do in the concrete? But you could pray, and the power of prayer coming from individuals who are becoming more in love with God, or at least purified of the false self, is going to pour mysterious but very real positive energy into the world that may lead to a greater possibility of peace. In any case, the inner room then is the place where the Holy Spirit, or Jesus as the divine therapist, gradually reveals to us the contents of our unconscious, the undigested emotional wounds of a lifetime, which come to our awareness sometimes during the prayer in the form of primitive emotions, raw emotions like grief, anger, depression, but they have no relationship to the immediate past. And that's the sign that they're actually coming as a healing process from our psychological tummy, so to speak, that has never digested the original pain of the trauma that took place either in one incident or in a series of incidents that became habitual. All those who have suffered oppression over an extended period of time have great pain of this kind. Most of it is unconscious to them. But it's not surprising then that this pain sometimes erupts from the unconscious into extreme activity that we interpret as crime, but perhaps God interprets it quite differently, as simply a sign of the depth of the woundedness of this person. So the way to solve this problem is not to build more prisons, I assure you. Who's going there? Your grandchildren at this rate, because there's so many of them, and so numerous, and they even privatize them now so that it's a way to make money. Stick people in jail and keep them there as long as possible. The whole system is very sick and in need of profound reorganization. And instead of rehabilitation, apart from some efforts in the federal prison, people are just being warehoused as useless bodies in so many state and county jails that they're only making people worse. It's an appalling destruction of human potentiality to stow people away there and think they're going to not cause any harm. They'll just be worse when they come out, unless the real efforts at rehabilitation. Well, here is where, if we could persuade people early in life to be aware of the dynamics of how the false self grows, perhaps some of the problems could be addressed early enough in their lives before they develop kind of reactions that force some kind of restraining action. For ourselves, besides this healing of the negative energies that we've absorbed and which are largely hidden from us, and the purification of the unconscious, there is this other work of that is involved with the affirmation of our basic goodness and consists in the releasing of the enormous gifts that God has given us in baptism and perhaps, or whenever we attain to the life of grace. And these are, first of all, the divine indwelling, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit dwelling within us, and then the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, the moral virtues that are infused, fortitude, temperance, prudence, and justice, and then the fruits of the Spirit described in Paul, Galatians 5, which are charity, joy, peace, gentleness, meekness, patience, self-control, goodness, and several others. And then the Beatitudes, which are even more profound exercises of virtue and manifestations of Christ's risen presence within us. In other words, they are the signs as they're released from what might be called the ontological unconscious. The unconscious that is similar in the sense that it's unconscious to us, but is also just as present, but totally positive as a counterpart to the psychological unconscious, where the repressed material of a lifetime needs to be brought to consciousness in order to release it. It doesn't require, most of the time, anything more than feeling it and it's gone. It's just energy, but when it's repressed, it interferes with the free flow of our positive energies. Well, here then is what is happening in the inner room. As we open ourselves, mind and heart, to the divine presence, we begin to release those gifts that as kind of our endowment as a result of baptism. And it's like a trousseau, you might say, in which the prospective bride is given suitable ornaments and furnishings and other things that prepares, in olden times, prepared someone to be a respectable bride at a fairly fancy wedding. In other words, God has called us to the spiritual marriage, but he doesn't expect us to walk in naked. That would not be appropriate. He gives us so many gifts that we're able, as these are activated through the regular period of centering prayer, you begin to experience the divine life within you. You begin to express spontaneously the kind of selfless love, the kind of joy in everyday life, the kind of peace that surpasses all understanding, a certain gentleness, meekness, which is no energy for anger, goodness, which is the capacity to see God in nature and in other people and in events. In other words, all of these wonderful gifts begin to be activated as you hang out in this inner room without any effort of your own, especially, except to accept the dark side of your personality, as the divine therapist shows this to us, not to trip us up, but because you've got to recognize this stuff and own it in order to work through it and get rid of it. Most of it can be gotten rid of without a lot of psychotherapy, but some things are so complex or hindrance that therapy can help. So don't be afraid to use enlightened therapy to further the work of the inner freedom if you have something that's a special problem, like rejection, like abuse of some kind or other. This normally benefits from the help of an expert, which reinforces then the healing effort of the divine action and vice versa. So in the inner room, therefore, God is doing these two things, affirming our basic goodness, releasing these extraordinary gifts that are freely given in baptism or whenever you reach grace, or perhaps with birth, I don't really know. It's also unloading the emotional baggage of a lifetime that was hidden in the unconscious. Hence, every time you go into this room, you're experiencing the movement of inner freedom, of a certain sense of peace, of joy, of coming home, of relationship with God. And you're finding what true happiness actually is. That even if it's only a little taste, but that taste draws you on to move even deeper beyond the spiritual level of the being into your true self, into union, the spiritual marriage, and into unity, where the divine love becomes who you are. And basically, that is who we are. We just can't believe it or think it can't be true. It is true. And so this movement into silence is, or stillness, as I described it, a cascading movement into peace and quiet, and even letting go of self-reflection. This then initiates and supports the whole healing process, which is the redemption of our being, body, soul, and spirit, and our concern, because being is concern for everything that is. So as we participate in God's being, your relationship with others will improve spontaneously, and our sense of stewardship for the earth and the universe increases. We experience then belonging to creation, and belonging to God, and belonging to each other, willing to share, as Jesus did, the sufferings of the world in order to further everybody else's transformation. And perhaps at this a moment in history, one quote I'd like to leave you with, and that is the Holy Father, Pope John Paul II, in his Millennium Letter about just before the year 2000, said the three things that need to be emphasized in the next century or millennium, in his view, and these were, or practices that would be most appropriate for our time. And he said one was the liturgy of the hours, by which he means Vespers and Lauds, which are mostly the Psalms, in which you sort of put one in contact with the liturgy of the Roman Catholic Church, the prayer of the church as a whole. But the other two are especially interesting. The second one is Lectio Divina, and the third one is contemplative prayer. So I venture to say that if you're doing centering prayer, you're in complete agreement, or at least you're on the main direction in which this holy man is expressing the movement of the Spirit. So the Spirit also is very evident in the desire or need of many people around the world for a deeper meaning in life and a closer union with God. And this is what you're contributing to, primarily in being faithful and regular to the inner room and to praying in secret. The reason Jesus says to pray in secret is interesting. It's because your Father who is in secret will reward you. So if God is a secret, that's the only place you'll find him, by becoming secret too, especially secret to yourself during the prayer, which really means not that you'll forget yourself utterly, but that your investment in your own self-interest begins to go down, leaving you free to be and to do whatever God calls you to do. Bottom line, of course, remains love is all.